In this presentation, I will be discussing the Robert E. Lee Monument in Fort Myers. And some of the topics I will cover are the history of the monument, its funding efforts, the dedication ceremonies, and its relevance, not only back then, but today. Now, much as a journalist, when required to go out to an event or an incident, the story they must present will include the who, what, why, when, where, and how of that event or incident. And in evaluating whether or not a monument should remain in its location or whether it would be best to remove it to a more suitable location, uh, the people involved in this decision should know the who, what, why, when, where, and how of that monument, the entire history of it. And in this presentation, I'm going to try to present as much information as I was able to find. First is who, and we know who this monument was to, but who really was he? How much do we really know about Robert E. Lee? And how do we know about him? Now, it's very important that you have a good understanding of the individual, all aspects of him. And to get the better understanding of him, you have to place yourself in his times. You have to try to understand the individual, the society in which he grew that influenced and helped in his development, as well as the culture in which this individual lived. If you try to judge anyone living in the 1800s using a 21st century outlook or mind, you will always have a poor interpretation of their actions. You can always say, well, they should have done this, or why did they do this? A role of a historian is to try to place him or herself in that time period to better understand that individual and their actions and decisions. And I'll give you an example. My grandfather was involved in an incident that when I found this out, it really disturbed me. It created uh, an image of him that I had trouble reconciling with. And it wasn't until much later that I think I discovered the how or the why he acted the way he did at this time. And it made all the sense in the world. And it helped me to not only understand him, but to re-accept him. And this is important. We must understand. In discussing who, you also have to discuss who the people were that erected the monument. In this case, it was the Letitia Ashmore Nutt chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, based in the Fort Myers area. This photograph here is of Letitia Ashmore Nutt. I will be discussing her in just a minute. And this is a photograph taken in 1966 of the unveiling of the Robert E. Lee Monument in Fort Myers. Now, as regards to who erects the monument, you must consider whether it's an individual using individual funds, whether it was an organization with fundraising capacities, and what type of organization it was, or was it a government? And as well, how did the funding come about? Well, in this case, the Letitia Ashmore Nutt chapter, like other chapters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, I would describe, in my opinion, were not only a social, but more importantly, a civic organization involved in commemorating Southern heritage and memory throughout the years. And they did extensive work in this. not only in erecting monuments, but also in educational aspects as well. More important in our assessment, I believe, is why. Why was the monument erected? And this goes to the reason and not motive. Motive has a bad connotation, but reason. The real reason that this monument was put up. And in a lot of cases, we don't know. We can only speculate. But one of the ways in which we get insight into this is from the dedication speech. What was said, the composition of the speech, and the demeanor of the speaker. Other aspects which can give an indication attest to the crowd that is present, the participants, maybe onlookers in the area. What was their, how did they participate, or did they participate? What was the size of the crowd? What was the makeup of the crowd? Crowd is probably a poor term, I apologize, but how did they act, if they acted at all? So this is as important as the why, and it gives you an indication. I will give you an example. Many people will tell you that erecting Confederate monuments emphasize white supremacy. And there is some degree of truth in this argument. There was a dedication speech given in North Carolina. True fact that during the speech, the speaker identified a black woman who had assisted Union Army troops during the occupation of this portion of North Carolina. And after the speech was completed, several of the onlookers sought this woman out, tortured, and lynched her. This is the power of a dedication speech. And this is why a dedication speech is so important to our assessment. The remaining considerations needed for our assessment are what? Well, what was the monument? What did the monument consist of? And this is fairly obvious looking at it. However, in the base of the monument, there is a surprise, so to speak, or materials there of interest, which I'll discuss later on, when the monument was erected. And the date can be reflective of perhaps a reason why this monument was erected when it was. And a later slide that I have, which I will show you, will better explain this. Where the monument was erected, did the individual or organization purchase the land, or was the land given to them by a government or donated by a private individual? So where is important in that aspect, and how is the actual physical assembly of the monument? And I'll briefly touch on that later. Before we begin our assessment, I'd like to present to you 4 quotes which I think are extremely important to consider. I call them statements to reflect upon. The first is an excerpt of a letter written by Robert E. Lee to his ex-staff officer, Charles Marshall. Marshall was the individual who would write a lot of Lee's orders and was almost constantly around Lee during the war years. And Lee wrote this to him several months before he died. And he stated, "Patriotism sometimes requires of men to act exactly contrary at one period to that which it does at another. And the motive that impels them, the desire to do right, is precisely the same." The next quote to build on, which I believe is extremely significant, is that by Gaines Foster in his book, Ghosts of the Confederacy. And he wrote, "Heritage and memory are not history. They are beliefs. This by itself does not make them wrong or evil. All of us have a heritage and a memory of our forebears, which we keep throughout our lives. It may be a racial heritage, an ethnic heritage, or a religious heritage, or combinations of each. And as I think of this statement, there are even political heritages, military heritage, civic heritage, and so forth. We all have a heritage and we all have a memory. They are not wrong, but they are not history. And this is from, again, Gaines Foster. The third comment, statement by David Blight and Karen Cox, both eminent historians in their own right, have written that monuments are less about the person commemorated, less about the individual on that pedestal, but more about the people that erected it. And this is their take, and I believe a very important insight into monuments as a topic. My last statement, perhaps one of controversy, was taken from David Levin's website, and it goes, statues are not history. They commemorate history. All history should be remembered. Not all history should be commemorated. There are people that will argue with this fact, that they will say, when you take down my statue, you're removing my history. But really, what is a statue? And that is something which you're going to have to, we have to decide ourselves its definition. I believe it's not history, but there are many people that will tell you that it is their history. I believe it commemorates history. I may be wrong. A little bit of local history for background. In 1866 to 1866 to 1887, Fort Myers was part of Monroe County, the largest county in the United States at the time. The county seat was Key West. In 1885, the town was incorporated. In 1886, the name was changed to Myers. It was not Fort Myers. The topic of a different discussion. Some of the grievances that people had was that the distance made doing business in the county seat impracticable. The trip required up to about a week if you were going by ship. Steamboat was a little bit quicker. Trips were expensive. Litigation, civil actions, even criminal adjudications became extremely difficult and difficult to arrange. Tax appeals were cost prohibitive. It would cost you more money to get there than you would save. And the people in this area, the Fort Myers area, felt that their tax dollars were not giving them any benefit. There was no roads or bridges or public improvements going on. Now, in May of 1886, a schoolhouse burns down. It was not this schoolhouse. This is the first schoolhouse in Fort Myers, but it was the high school. Some believe that the students set it on fire because the weather was nice. That's a story of its own. A town delegation was assembled and traveled to Key West to ask for funds to rebuild the school. And the county commissioners claimed that the town had been careless with the county money, allowing that school to burn down. And they basically told the town delegation to go pound sand, if you will. They weren't going to give them any money. Now, it very well may have been that they were going to give them money later on, but they had no funds to give them at that time. Irregardless, when the delegation returns to the area, the citizens' reaction was described as incensed. And there was a clamor for a separation from Monroe County to form a new a better representative county, if you will. Well, the county commissioners will send up a delegation to inspect the Fort Myers area, and they decide to contract with Joseph Vivas to construct some bridges across Whiskey Creek and Billy's Creek. Vivas would claim that he was not paid well for the job. He lost money on the deal. He was only paid $949. However, the roads in Fort Myers are really nothing but cattle trails or cart paths. They're dirt, they're in the dry weather, they're wind-blown sand, and after rains, they're muddy, they get rutted, the ruts stay in the dry weather. They're just horrible situation. And this sudden burst of attention by the county commissioners does nothing to appease the citizens' anger. And they decide to establish a petition, send it around not only to the Fort Myers people, but people in the surrounding areas to sign, and they do. And then they send a delegation, which consists of the wealthy and influential cattlemen in the area, and they are led by Francis Asbury Hendry. And they will go to Tallahassee to present this petition and proposal for a new county. On May 2nd of 1887, the bill which would create the new county passes the state legislature, and in a meeting in the area, Francis Asbury Hendry will get up and he will propose that the new county be named Lee County, and he is naming it after Robert E. Lee. Now, at this time, Tom Hall, who is the head of the Arts Commission for the city of Fort Myers, and if I don't have the title correct, I apologize to him. Tom Hall would liken Francis Asbury Hendry to Ben Cartwright from the Bonanza series, and I think that's an excellent comparison. Hendry was not only a wealthy cattleman, he had in the 1880s over 50,000 head selling cattle to Cuba on a continual basis, but he was also very influential in the Fort Myers area. He had been here during the Third Seminole War, during the Civil War. He was part of the Cattle Guard Battalion in the Battle of Fort Myers, if you will, and afterwards he has played a continual role in the town, politically as well as civically. And he gets up and he proposes that the county is named after Lee County, and everybody accepts it. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the dedication speech. To perhaps better understand or put in better perspective the reason why F.A. Hendry decided to name the new county after Robert E. Lee, I turn you now to a 2014 rededication ceremony and an excerpt of the address given by Dr. Ted Childress, who was an Estero resident and military historian. And I quote him, "That period in history," and we're talking now about 1887, "that period in history was characterized by greed, labor unrest, and political corruption and cronyism. The people needed to be reminded of the collective importance of attributes such as honesty and integrity. It was not Lee's successes and failures on the battlefield that Francis Asbury Hendry hoped the citizens of Lee County would remember 125 years later. It was Lee's iron integrity, his utter devotion to the truth." This last sentence will be repeated again when we discuss the dedication speech in 1966. I now want to turn my attention to the fundraising efforts for the monument, and this was spearheaded by the Letitia Ashmore Nutt chapter 1447 of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, established in February 1913. Well, who was Letitia Ashmore Nutt? She was married to Leroy Moncour Nutt, who was a Confederate cavalryman during the Civil War. In the Trans-Mississippi, initially, he was a prisoner of war, and after he was exchanged, he became a scout for the Army of Tennessee under the command of Joseph Johnston. And all throughout his deployment, and including the time that he was a prisoner of war, Letitia would be by his side. She would be taking care of him when he was wounded, as well as attending to him when he was well, all throughout the war. Well, he would die in 1882, and then Letitia, her 3 daughters, and brother would move to Sanibel, where they settled as pioneers. She would become ultimately a teacher there and would continue on in maintaining the Southern heritage and memories of which were part of her life. Letitia would die in 1914. The chapter named after her would begin, or had begun, raising funds to establish a monument for Robert E. Lee. And by this time in 1915, they had raised anywhere from $1,500 to $1,800 going toward the monument. However, a greater need at this time was to assist in the establishment of a hospital in the town of Fort Myers. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy, this chapter, would donate their entire funds to the upkeep and building, I should say, of the new hospital in Fort Myers. And they would ask that this hospital be named Robert E. Lee Memorial Hospital, and it was named that. Years later, however, to shorten the name, it will be known as the Lee Memorial Hospital. A second fund effort would be started around 1940, and at this time they would collect about $500, but a greater need was found again, and they decided to donate that money to furnish and supply the baby nursery, or the nursery, I should say, at the Robert E. Lee Memorial Hospital. By 1953, a third funding effort would start. It would stall for a period of time with the death of the chapter president, Mrs. Fannie Mae Wisnett. The funds would be deposited in the Lee County Bank, and then by the late 1950s and early 60s, the fund effort would continue in earnest. They would need $6,000 for the complete project, and the money was raised throughout contributions by fund drives, donations from private citizens, children's, and businesses. When the bust was completed, it was on display at the Lee County Courthouse, and in front of it was a donation box in which change of all sorts was donated through this as well. This is an example of one of the many fundraising letters which was sent out by the chairwoman of the Fund Commission for the UDC, Edna F. Grady Roberts. And again, she mentions that the total cost is $6,000, and she requests contributions as you would expect. And she also indicates that the City Council has allotted a space in the median strip. This is of Monroe Street, facing First Street. And this location was not the original location intended. That would be at the site of the hospital. However, with the expansion of the hospital, by this time, the hospital expansion had taken over that portion of land, which was to be where the monument was to be located. And now they were granted by the city this portion of land on Monroe Street, facing toward First Street for the location. By the mid 1960s, they were about $1,000 short. And the fundraising would continue. An example shown here in a photograph from the news press, the Lee High School students would proceed to sell banks with the donations going toward the funding efforts as well. And as the funds came in, they were finally able to put the last payment in of $1,760. And then this is the copy of the cashier's check, and then a copy of the paid in full receipt from the G.E. Crone Monument Company that would be doing the installation. So everything now was ready. Well, let's talk now about the monument specifics. As I stated, it cost $6,000. The bust was 1.5 times life size, and it was sculpted in Italy by Aldo Pero. The pedestal was of polished Georgia granite, about 10.5 feet high. It was erected by the Crone Monument Company from Memphis, Tennessee, and George E. Crone Jr. stated that at the time he could find no other monument to Robert E. Lee in the South outside of Richmond, excluding small busts that may have been present in some of the state capitals of the southern states. So this is pretty much the monument specifics, and I'll be talking in just a minute about something of importance in the base of the monument. In January of 1966, James Clifford and Mrs. Edna F. Roberts placed a number of Civil War relics in a plastic container that was to be placed in the base of the monument itself as part of the footing. Mr. Clifford, James Clifford, was a Virginia battlefield relic collector. Retired from the Navy Department. He was a resident in the area, and he donated all of these items that were placed in the base of the monument in this plastic container. And a photograph here of Mrs. Roberts. Now the relics consisted of, to give you an example, a bronze sword hilt from the Confederate line, a fragment of an exploded Schenkel shell. A Schenkel shell was an artillery, one type of artillery shell used in the war, a Confederate gun strap, a Confederate belt buckle, a fragment of a 12-inch artillery shell, a canister shot. Now, canister shot would be about the size of a grape, a good sized grape, a little bit bigger. There would probably be anywhere from 15 to 20 of them in a metal can that would be placed in an artillery piece, fired, and the can would break, and all of these canister shots would then spread out like a shotgun pellets after fired. However, obviously they were much bigger, and if you were ever hit with a canister shot, you would probably regret it for the rest of your life if you had a life afterwards. Also would be 2 .58 caliber rounds of ammunition, a 58 caliber mini ball, the end of a bayonet scabbard, a 69 caliber round of ammunition, a bayonet, and then a small bronze plaque bearing 2 bullets and an arrowhead, which James Clifford recovered at the 90th anniversary commemoration of the Spotsylvania battlefield in May of 1954. So all of these relics were placed in a plastic container in the footing of the Lee Memorial Monument. The dedication of the monument was on January 19th, 1966, the 159th anniversary of Robert E. Lee's birth. Here we have a photo of the plaque at the base of the monument, again saying that the monument is sponsored by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. and named Lee County in honor of the man for whom the county was named. And over here we have a picture of Mrs. D.P. Roberts admiring her efforts. I include this slide, which is prepared by the Southern Poverty Law Center. It shows the timeline of Confederate iconography over the years to show you or to superimpose the fund drive efforts along this timeline. And of note are the monuments which are represented in these orange peaks and valleys, and schools, which are the gray color that you will see in certain areas. And I show you 1915. This is when they first established the $1,500 to $1,800 fund, which was donated to the hospital. In 1940, at this point in time, notice how the monument building now has decreased from a tremendous height around 1909 to 1912. In 1940, this is the time when the nursery funds were donated. 1953 was when they restarted the fund drive, finally completed in 1966. But I point out here in 1953, the pivotal Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, which would force the integration of public schools. And as you notice, after a period of relative inactivity, all of a sudden monument building, as well even more school building, will increase during this time. Some of the schools would be built to accommodate integration. However, some of the schools would also be built to accommodate whites-only private schools, prep schools, if you will. One may wonder how much influence this Supreme Court decision for school integration had on monument construction. As to our example, you can only speculate, and I don't feel comfortable in speculating if or if not it had an influence. But throughout the country, it did have an influence in other areas. I'll now turn to the dedication speech, the what I call the meat of the coconut, if I can use that analogy. This was given by Mr. Lloyd G. Hendry, and he will be referencing his great-grandfather's account from a history of the early days of Fort Myers. And excerpts of this speech will be taken from that account. These are all quotes from the dedication speech. First, my great-grandfather made the motion to name that new county in honor of the South's noblest son, Robert E. Lee. To that motion, there was no debate, only instant and wild acclaim. Many of the town's males were Confederate veterans. Appomattox and Reconstruction had not quenched the feverish loyalty and deep devotion of these men for the Confederacy's commander-in-chief. It was in these times and in this spirit that Lee County selected and chose its namesake. He continues, I have read my great-grandfather's writings of his deep admiration of Robert E. Lee. He spoke not of his prowess in war, but of other qualities. First, he spoke of his iron integrity, his utter devotion to truth. This quality of Lee is legendary. I stop here to remind you of Dr. Childress' address in 2014. He continues, then he spoke of Lee's deep and abiding concern for his fellow men. These are the qualities the man who named Lee County hoped the people of Lee County would emulate. He would end by saying, "And I would hope that as future generations look upon this monument, which the United Daughters of the Confederacy here so nobly dedicate to posterity, on this his 159th birthday, these future men and women of this county will say, 'Give us hearts to match his courage, give us faith to match his creed, let us live to match his honor in every word and thought and deed.'" And he ends by saying, "Thank you." Those previous quotes were the salient issues which Lloyd Hendry presented during the dedication speech. However, 97 years earlier, on August 5th, 1869, Robert E. Lee wrote to the Gettysburg Memorial Battlefield Association, and he was declining an invitation to assist in the placement of regimental and brigade monuments on the battlefield. He was requested to come to the battlefield to help them in the placement of some of these monuments, and he declined. Lee wrote to them, "I believe if there, I could not add anything material to the information on the subject. I think it wise, moreover, not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the examples of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife, to commit to oblivion the feelings it engendered. Very respectfully yours, your obedient servant." Now, this is Robert E. Lee requesting for us to put the conflict behind. We must move on. And he basically comes out and says, no monuments, no monuments. With Lee's advice to put this conflict behind us and implying not to erect monuments, today we are faced with heritage on one side and rage on the other. And this began in earnest in 2015 with the Charleston church shootings. And at this time, historians, in talking about monuments, began to advocate not to remove the monuments, but to try to modify and use them as tools of education by applying signage in front of and along the monuments to give information about the individual involved, his role, importance, his deficiency, his or her deficiencies, and so forth. It was hoped at the time that this would help alleviate the situation. However, with other circumstances, you can see how we have changed today from before and currently. So concentrating on the Lee Monument in Fort Myers, let us review some of the main aspects, starting off with why. The apparent reasons for establishing this memorial exhibit no overt indications that it promoted white supremacy or racial casting. The plaque itself at the base states that it is dedicated to the man whom Lee County was named after. The dedication speech itself is devoid of glorification of the Confederacy, of its cause. Many of the speeches at this time, when monuments were erected, promoted these ideas. The address itself was a short address by Lloyd G. Hendry, in which he reiterated Francis Asbury Hendry's belief in the importance of Lee's character traits, specifically integrity and honesty, hoping that these traits would be emulated by the people in Lee County. The attendees were mostly members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, their spouses, and invited guests, as well as a number of interested individuals. As to when it certainly could have been established sooner, the first funding was over about the 1915 time. This was after the peak establishment of Confederate memorials, which was about from 1906 to 1912. Must be remembered that the first two funding attempts, the money which was obtained was donated by the United Daughters of the Confederacy to assist in the hospital. And in return, in the first donation, they did request a hospital be named after Robert E. Lee, which it was. And then over time, this was shortened to Lee Memorial Hospital. As to the effect of the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, whether this had a role in increasing funding and the establishment of the monument is only speculative. There seems to be no evidence of that at all. It is important to note that during this time period, there was the delay in segregation. However, there appears to be no apparent indication that the establishment of the Lee Monument played any role, but it did occur during this time. Lastly, we come to the category of who, which is two parts. The first being who erected or established the monument, and that is the Letitia Ashmore Nutt chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the Fort Myers area. This chapter was formed much later than others. It could very well have been this way because of the population dynamics in southern Florida at this time, being less densely settled than other areas. It was established as a social, but more importantly, a civic organization which stressed Southern heritage and memory and educational promotion and aspects for the efforts of the same heritage and memory. As a tangent, it is important to note that the United Daughters of the Confederacy as an organization has disavowed the use of the Confederate battle flag as a sign or symbol of white supremacy or racial hate. This is found in their mission statements, and it is an organization which lives behind this. They are supportive of the Confederate battle flag as being a flag of honor that the Confederates followed in battle, but disavow its use, which has been hijacked by extremist and radical groups since the 1950s and perhaps even before that. The considerations of why, when, and who erected the monument are perhaps not as significant as that as to whom the monument was erected, Robert E. Lee. I would like to give a brief overview of his of a biography of him to give you a better understanding. It will be by no means complete, but I will try to emphasize important features. Now, he was a military leader. He was a military officer his entire adult life. First in the United States Army as an engineering officer, a commandant at the commandant of West Point, and then he was a cavalry commander when stationed in Texas. With the secession of Virginia, he would assume command of all Virginia military forces. When the Virginia military forces were encompassed into the Confederate States Army, Lee would then become a general in the Confederate States Army. Ultimately, he would command the Army of Northern Virginia, the main Confederate army in the Eastern Theater. He has been described as a Christian gentleman. His Christian beliefs would develop more strongly after his marriage to his wife Mary, and he strongly believed that God directed man's actions, man's successes and failures, and this direction was for his, God's aims. And this is a very important thing to remember about Lee and this relationship with God, how God basically oversaw all of man's actions. As a gentleman, his demeanor, his actions were highly regarded and admired by people of his stature, as well as his peers, and by everyone in the Confederacy during and after the war. He was considered for his integrity and honesty. And if there is one word to describe Robert E. Lee's character, the word would be duty. Lee had an extreme belief, extreme strength in the belief of the word duty and its responsibilities. And his responsibilities in duty would extend to the position in which he was in. For example, as a military leader, he would not consider himself to get involved with political decisions. His concern was for military decisions and military activities. In regards to secession, Lee was against secession during the pre-war times. He considered it to be a revolution. It would destroy, in his belief, all that the founding fathers tried to establish, and he was greatly opposed to the whole idea of secession. Now, it must be remembered that during this time, that the loyalty to one's state was much stronger than that to the nation. And by that, I'll give you an example. If someone were to ask you who you were, Lee, for example, would say that I'm a Virginian. I would say I'm a New Hampshireman. Someone else would say I'm a South Carolinian or a Georgian or a Minnesotan or a New Yorker. This was considered at this time still a holdover of previous ideas. You were more committed to your state. And Lee, prior to the secession of Virginia, even though he opposed secession, he would say that if necessary, that he would resign his commission, go back to his home state of Virginia and farm, and raise his sword only in defense of his state. And if you look at it in one set of viewers, that's basically what he did. Now, it's important to note that prior to his leaving the United States Army, he was offered command of all United States troops. He turned this down. He then was offered the command of the Virginia troops, which he accepted, and this was after Virginia seceded from the Union. It is also, it must be known that during this time as well, he was being courted prior to his decision by a representative from the Virginia governor to accept command of Virginia forces. He was, as I stated, strongly opposed to secession prior to the war, but after the war, he seemed to temper his opinion as to secession, and he tried to justify it by using the arguments of states' rights and so forth. His decision to resign his commission from the United States Army was described as a very difficult one. His daughter describes hearing footsteps in the study all night long prior to his decision, Lee going back and forth, thinking and so forth. So it was a very difficult decision for him. He has been labeled a traitor as a result of it by some. He has been admired deeply by others. It is important to note that yes, he did have loyalty to Virginia, and he maintained that loyalty to the end. There were other United States Army officers from Virginia, however, that did not resign, go with the Confederacy, but remained with the United States Army. So this was a personal decision that Lee was going through, and it was an extremely conflicted decision. In regards to slavery, Robert E. Lee had no direct experience in managing slaves, in managing a plantation. He disliked the entire process of this. He did not want to get involved with it. And he did with the death of his father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis. He became the executor of the estate and was required to pay off all of the debt of the 3 plantations which Custis had owned. They were in a lot of debt, primarily because of the mismanagement of his labor force, the slaves. Custis and his wife were considered to be very liberal in their treatment of the slaves. And as a result, compared to other plantations in which the discipline was more strictly enforced or harsher, their slaves accomplished less than others. Lee was faced to pay off the debt. The slaves were to be emancipated as soon as possible, but within 5 years. So with facing this debt, Lee began first off to rent out slaves to other managers for money. He would also sell slaves, and this caused problems with the Arlington slaves. It would break up marriages. The Custises were trying to, or had in the past, encouraged marriage and respected the bonds of marriage. However, with Lee selling slaves, this broke up families. There was a lot of anger, consternation against Lee because of this, despite the fact that Lee was doing this, of course, to try to get rid of the debt. It held him in low regard as far as the states were concerned, the slaves were concerned, excuse me. And there was also the question of brutality toward the slaves. And this comes out in an incident known as the Wesley Norris incident. It was published in a paper prior to the breakout of hostilities and the war. Wesley Norris, his sister, and a cousin ran away from the Arlington plantation, got as far as Maryland, were captured, brought back, and as a form of punishment, Lee demanded they be whipped. The overseer would not apply the punishment. Lee hired a constable to do it. The constable did apply the whip, as well as, according to Wesley Norris, Lee himself whipped his sister. And when finished, brine was poured in all of their wounds. Lee himself would deny this report, would never claim it to be factual. His supporters discounted. They would state one of the refutations was that the Norris family were upset at Lee for breaking up the family prior to this, and this was a form of blackmail against his reputation and so forth. There are indications of truth in this, and one could say, yes, this is an actual event. How it played out, there are some gray areas in it. So again, this is a disturbing thing which we again have to consider. Now, Lee himself considered slavery to be beneficial and necessary in the advancement of blacks as a race. This was a necessary step in their maturation. He also believed that emancipation would be the result of God's work. Again, think of his Christian belief that God is working in man's affairs. Well, it was not going to be man that emancipated the blacks, it was going to be God in his due time. And it would not be accomplished by coercion or violence. And this was Lee firing a broadside against the abolitionists of the North. As well, Lee held blacks in low regard. Well, before that, excuse me, he believed in a gradual emancipation. This was prior to and after the war, and he thought that it was best that this would occur only when the blacks were ready, had been better educated and matured to accept emancipation. He held blacks in low regard before and after the war. For example, in letters to his sons, he would say not to hire black workers, only white workers. And he made a statement saying that everything around the blacks is falling down and everything around the whites is building up. After emancipation, and this was a post-war statement, Lee stated that he would prefer that the blacks would leave Virginia after emancipation. Now, this in itself, sounding extreme, was very common, or I should say not uncommon, a feeling in the southern states as well as the northern states. Lee was a man of his times. He was no different than any other white Southerner of his class in his attitude, stature, beliefs, or position in society. He must be understood and not judged using the 21st century manners or knowledge that we have, or as I say it, don't judge him with 21st century glasses. His sins were those sins of the society in which he grew. This society was responsible for his upbringing and development, his education, as well as his attitudes, and his experiences, as well as the society would reinforce all of these beliefs. Religion, for example, just as a tangent, during this time would justify the institution of slavery as important. So Lee is a complicated and during this time a very conflicted individual. This time was filled with controversy as well as distress, not too much unlike what we're going through. It is important to note that his health deteriorated during the last 2 years of the war, starting in 1863. It got much worse as time went on. After the war, he was suffering from cardiac problems. He would die within 5 years of the surrender of Appomattox. I believe that during this time, if you read his letters, some of the interviews he did, there were alterations in his pre-war statements. And I believe that perhaps with these reflections, he may have been trying to justify or absolve some of the harshness of these beliefs. And finally, as you may expect, the objection to the memorial, the monument to Lee, more than likely is going to be based upon Robert E. Lee himself and not anything which the United Daughters did in the establishment of the monument. I believe that monuments may be used as an educational tool to instruct people about historical figures displayed on these monuments. A mini history of the person may be placed upon signage, which would be placed in front of or on the sides of the monument to allow people that when they approach the monument to read and perhaps hopefully get a better understanding of the individual as a historical figure. I admit the signage may be vandalized and destroyed, and I also admit that many people will not take the time to stop and read. However, I also believe that the educational value of attempting this far outweighs anything else that we can do. This ends my presentation. I hope you found it informative as well as interesting, and I thank you for your attention.